Hi, my name is Siobhan Flaherty. I am a senior here at the University of Vermont. I am a sociology and Spanish major, and this report is on the book titled Mortal Sins by Michael D. Antonio. And the book is about the sexual abuse that went on in the Catholic Church in the 20th century, mostly focusing on the abuse that occurred in the later half of the 20th century, how this then in the 21st century became very public knowledge, and there was a very publicized scandal in results to various journal articles that happened in the early 2000s, as well as the beginning of people suing the Catholic Church and bringing priests to justice beginning in the 1980s and the 1990s. I would say that this book relates to me on a personal level only because I was raised Roman Catholic and my dad had considered becoming a priest for a number of years. So the book begins, the first chapter is basically a brief history of the Catholic Church. And it talks about how the church has a lot of power, more in the past, on social and political lives. And it also goes into the priesthood and how one of the cardinal rules of being a priest is a vow of celibacy, and how this was obviously violated during this time of scandal. Chapters 2 through 14 focus more on case studies, specifically having to do with the lawyer Thomas Anderson and Father Thomas Doyle, who really became advocates during the 1980s, 90s, and into the 2000s for victims of sexual abuse by priests. And these first chapters also explain how these scandals really even happened. Goes into explaining how the church is so powerful, how the people in power, the bishops, the Pope, were very much aware of the problem. This was no secret to them, but they enabled these priests to continue to abuse children, usually by moving priests to various churches as opposed to just pulling them out of the priesthood. These chapters touch on the fact that most of the time these priests were not sued because the church either paid off victims as well as encouraging victims not to go publicly. It also goes into the fact that in this kind of culture of Catholicism, especially during the second half of the 20th century, that children were really put in these vulnerable positions because they were not encouraged to speak out in Catholicism in a traditional sense. Children were encouraged to only listen to priests as if they were, unquestionable, and then they needed to respect them. And priests had such a tremendous influence on many children because not only were children involved in the church as being altar boys or singing for the church, but these priests ran orphanages and they ran schools. So many priests had various opportunities to abuse children, not only because of their power, but because the church dominated a lot of parts of children's lives in that time period. The chapters 2 through 14 also also explain this idea of clericalism, which is this Catholic mindset that basically proclaims that ordained men are kind of above the law, and that this leads to corruption, which obviously it is very clear that it did. So then chapters in 15 touch on a case of Cardinal Bernardine, and he was accused of sexually abusing a man named Stephen Cook, and he came forward and then eventually ended up dropping the charges because he said that he kind of had false memory. So that was only one example. The beginning chapters only focus on examples where these priests were basically proven to have abused these children, and Thomas Anderson was representing victims as they began to come forward. And then this was an example of someone who had been falsely accused, or it was never proven. Chapters 17 and 18 talk more about the case studies having to do with Thomas Anderson. Then chapters 19 and 20 focus on the articles that were published in the Boston Globe beginning in 2002. And these articles really spurred more of a movement. Before, there had been the organization called SNAP, which was advocating for victims of sexual abuse by priests. But these articles in the Boston Globe really caught the attention of the entire United States. My dad remembers when these articles broke across the news and how really this had such a tremendous impact, and it even ended up having an impact in Ireland. This publicity really inspired more of a deeper look into what was going on in the Catholic Church and what these priests were doing to some children. This inspired more documentaries to be made. And in Ireland, it's a little different than the United States because not only was there tremendous sexual abuse by priests of children in Ireland, but there are also issues around orphanages and women basically being used for slave labor if they were prostitutes or teenage mothers. So there are many more issues that the Catholic Church has created in Ireland, and D'Antonio touches on this, and this more has to do with the fact that the Catholic Church and the government of Ireland and the society of Ireland is so much more entwined with the Catholic Church than in the United States. Obviously, in some communities, like in Boston, where there are many more Roman Catholics than other areas of the United States, we see a similar effect on families, but it's nowhere near in Ireland. He talks about how almost 90% of people in Ireland attended Mass on Sundays traditionally, whereas after these abuses were publicized and society became a little more detached from the church, attending services on Sundays dropped to 62% and then 42%. Chapter 22 focuses on Pope John Paul II's death, and he was the Pope. He was the Pope for 26 years, and he really influenced the way in which the Catholic Church handled the scandal. He really did not have much interest or express much interest or remorse for the victims. He was always more concerned with how the scandal affected the Catholic Church. And he was just concerned with the welfare of the church. And he did claim that the child abuse was really more an influence of society as a whole, that these priests were abusing children because of the change in society, as opposed to attributing the problem to the Catholic Church, which I think most people would agree is very wrong. Then chapter 23 goes back to talking about Anderson and how he really became the voice or the face of a representative of victims in the United States. Chapter 24 is the last chapter, and this it's somewhat more hopeful than the rest of the book. Not tremendously, but Pope Benedict XVI, who was the Pope after John Paul II, he had a very different approach to how victims should be treated. He had public statements about how ashamed he was of this clerical abuse and how this was a huge problem, and then victims needed to be represented more. And the last chapter also touches on how in Ireland, even as late as 2011, there's still sexual abuse cases coming out. Obviously, it's dissipated, but it doesn't seem to be as hopeful. And this relates to why so many Irish Catholics are disenchanted with the church right now and probably don't practice anymore. I don't know if I would say there is an overall thesis to the book. I think there's a clear purpose to the book, which is to describe the tremendous crimes that were committed by these priests. Talk about how eventually there was a movement to bring them to justice, how the Catholic Church has lost many followers and many people are disenchanted with the Catholic Church. In the last chapter, D'Antonio talks about these elements of tragedy that occurred from this scandal and these years of abuse, and how the victims suffered the most, how this is so damaging to them and their communities really betrayed them. The Catholic Church has really been hit hard as well, and it should be this kind of pinnacle of morality, and it just is not that after the scandal, and has lost many people. I would say what I liked overall was just how comprehensive his account was of abuse in the Catholic Church. Clearly very detailed, very well researched. There was so much information, and I appreciated that he illustrated what was going on in the 80s and then the 90s and the 2000s and how there was this kind of progression. What I did not like about the book was a lot of discussions about Anderson, the lawyer's personal life. I didn't understand how his substance abuse really had any importance in his casework. The book even said that it didn't really affect his casework. So I just didn't think that had anything to do with really the purpose of the book, which is supposed to talk about sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. So thanks.